There is a particular kind of silence that exists in the Australian outback, not the silence of an empty room or a quiet street. Something older than that. A silence that has weight and texture that presses against your eardrums like the memory of sound rather than the absence of it. Farmers who have worked that land for generations describe it the same way, almost to a word. They say it is not quiet so much as it is waiting, as though the earth itself is holding something in, keeping something down, sealed beneath the red dust and the ancient granite and the roots of trees that were old when the first Europeans arrived and will still be standing long after the last of them are gone. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. The stories that live in the in-between places, the ones that were almost lost, the ones that governments preferred you never heard about, those are the ones worth telling slowly, in the dark, when the noise of the ordinary world has finally gone quiet. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time is it. This is a story about a farmer. His name was Edmund Callaway, and in the spring of 1923, he was working a stretch of land in the wheat belt region of Western Australia, about 200 kilometers east of Perth, in country that most people drove through without stopping. He was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had left school at 12 to help his father clear scrub, and by the time he was 34, he had spent more of his life walking that particular patch of earth than he had sleeping. He knew every rock formation, every dry creek bed, every termite mound. He thought he knew everything the land had to offer. He was wrong. The winter of 1923 had been unusually wet for that part of Western Australia. Rain that should have arrived in small grudging quantities had instead come in long sustained sheets for most of June and July. And by August, the ground in certain low-lying areas had shifted in ways that older farmers recognized as the earth rearranging itself. Sinkholes appeared in paddocks that had been solid for 50 years. Creek banks collapsed overnight, and in one corner of Callaway's eastern boundary, near a stand of salmon gum trees whose roots went down 20 feet into limestone substrate, a section of ground simply fell away. Callaway noticed it on a Tuesday morning. He had gone out to check on a fence line that had been behaving strangely, sagging in the middle without apparent cause, and when he reached the southeastern post, he found that the ground behind it had opened up into a depression, roughly 4 meters across, and perhaps a meter deep at its lowest point. He assumed it was a sinkhole. The limestone beneath that region is riddled with cave systems, most of them small, some of them unexplored, and collapses of this kind were not unheard of. He planned to fill it with rubble before his stock could injure themselves. But when he walked to the edge of the depression and looked in, he saw something that stopped him where he stood. The bottom of the depression was not bare earth and broken rock. It was stone, worked stone, flat slabs, laid in a pattern he could not immediately understand, fitted together with a precision that suggested intention. He climbed down carefully, knees in the red mud, and pressed his palms against the nearest slab. It did not shift, it did not flex. It was solid in the way that things built with genuine expertise are solid. The kind of solidity that comes not just from the weight of stone, but from the geometry of how stone is placed against stone. He ran his fingers along the joints between the slabs and found them almost seamless, the gaps barely wide enough to insert a fingernail. He went home and got his son. Together, they spent 3 days carefully clearing the mud and debris from the depression, working by hand because Callaway did not want to risk breaking whatever was beneath with a shovel. What they uncovered was the top surface of a structure that extended well beyond the boundaries of the original collapse. The worked stone continued in all directions under the undisturbed earth, and when they dug carefully around the edges, they found that the top surface was not the floor of something, but the ceiling. Beneath the collapsed section, accessed by a gap that the Earth's movement had opened in the side of the structure, was a chamber. Calloway was not a man given to dramatic statements. His wife later said that when he came in that third evening, he sat down at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. And when she asked him what was the matter, he simply said that he had found something he did not understand, and that he thought perhaps someone should be told. He wrote a letter to the Department of Lands in Perth. Then he wrote one to the University of Western Australia, which had been open for 13 years and had a small faculty of science. Then, because he was a thorough man, he wrote one to the Western Australian Museum. The letter to the museum arrived on the desk of a man named Frederick Hargrove, who was at that time the Deputy Curator of Natural History. Hargrove had spent most of his career cataloguing native fauna and had no particular expertise in archaeology, but the letter interested him enough that he brought it to the attention of the museum's director, a man named Arthur Pemberton Walsh, who read it twice, set it down, and then made a telephone call that Calloway would not know about for another 40 years, by which time it would matter very much indeed. To understand what came next, you need to understand something about Western Australia in 1923. The state was still in many respects a frontier. Perth was a city of fewer than 200,000 people. The interior was vast and largely unmapped in any meaningful detail. The question of what Australia had been before European settlement was not one that most white Australians asked with any seriousness, partly because the answer was understood to be simple, that Aboriginal people had been there, had lived in traditional ways, and that this history, while acknowledged in a vague and distant fashion, was not considered to have produced the kind of physical structures that would require serious archaeological investigation. This was the prevailing assumption. It was also deeply structurally convenient for a government that had spent the previous century systematically dispossessing Aboriginal Australians of their land, their children, and their culture. An assumption that Aboriginal history consisted of movement and memory rather than construction and permanence made certain legal and political questions much easier to answer. A stone chamber of unknown age and origin, fitted together with precision that no one could immediately explain, complicated that assumption in ways that were, to put it plainly, inconvenient. Calloway did not know any of this. He was a wheat farmer with a hole in his paddock and a structure inside it that he could not account for, and all he wanted was for someone with more knowledge than himself to come and have a look. Someone did come, but not who he expected. 3 weeks after sending his letters, Calloway received a visit not from a university professor or a museum curator, but from 2 men he had never seen before, who arrived in a government motorcar and introduced themselves as representatives of the Department of Lands. They were polite, they were thorough. They spent an afternoon at the site taking measurements and photographs, and they asked Calloway a great many questions about when he had found it and who he had told. They were particularly interested in the last question, who he had told. He mentioned his son, his wife, a neighbor named Patterson, who had come by chance one afternoon while they were still clearing debris, and had stood at the edge looking down for a long time without saying much. The government men wrote all of this down in a small notebook. Then one of them explained to Calloway that the structure appeared to fall within a geological survey zone that was of interest to the Commonwealth, and that the department would be taking over responsibility for the site while further investigations were conducted. He should not, the man said, allow anyone else onto the property to examine the area until he received further correspondence from the department. Calloway asked when he could expect that correspondence. The man said he was not in a position to specify a timeline. Calloway asked what would happen to the structure. The man said that would depend on the findings of the investigation. Then they drove away, and Edmund Calloway stood in his paddock in the autumn afternoon light and watched the government car disappear down the track toward the main road. And he had the feeling, which he described later and in detail to his daughter, that something had just been taken from him without anyone quite admitting that that was what had happened. The correspondence from the Department of Lands arrived 6 weeks later. It was a single page. It informed Calloway that the geological anomaly on his property had been assessed and found to present no features of scientific or historical significance. It recommended that the depression be filled and the land returned to agricultural use. It thanked him for bringing the matter to the department's attention. That was it. No mention of the worked stone, no mention of the chamber, no mention of the photographs the men had taken. Calloway wrote back. He received no reply. He wrote again, this time to the University of Western Australia. He never received a reply to that letter either. Many years later, when his daughter attempted to locate the original correspondence in the university's records, she found that there were no letters from anyone named Calloway in the files for 1923, and that several pages appeared to be missing from the general correspondence register for that year. What Calloway did next is where the story becomes something more than a bureaucratic curiosity. He was not, as I said, an educated man, but he was a methodical one. Before the government men had arrived and before their visit had made him nervous about what he did not yet understand, he had already done something that would prove important. He had taken photographs of his own, not professional photographs, not with any kind of expert equipment, but clear enough, taken with the box camera his wife used for family portraits. He had photographed the surface of the collapsed area from several angles. He had photographed the chamber entrance. He had gone inside the chamber itself and taken 3 photographs by lamplight. And while 2 of them came out too dark to show much detail, one of them, taken at the right moment when the lamp was positioned close to the far wall, showed clearly what was on that wall. There were markings. Not the kind of markings that water erosion produces, not the kind that root systems make when they press against stone over centuries. These were deliberate, regular, arranged in a pattern that Calloway, who had no knowledge of any writing system ancient or modern beyond the English he used every day, could not read but could recognize for what it was. Someone had made these marks with purpose. Someone had stood in that chamber and pressed or carved or scored these symbols into the stone and meant something by them. Calloway kept the photographs in an envelope in the drawer of his desk for the better part of a decade without showing them to anyone. He was not sure why. He told his daughter later that he had felt, from the moment the government men arrived, that he was in possession of something he was not supposed to have, and that the safest thing to do with something like that was to hold it quietly and wait to understand what it meant. The understanding did not come quickly. It came, in fact, in pieces over the course of the rest of his life, and some of it did not arrive until after he was gone. In 1931, Callaway's neighbor Patterson, the man who had stood at the edge of the collapsed area that afternoon 8 years before, came to the Callaway property with a newspaper clipping. He had found it in a 3-year-old copy of a Perth periodical that he had been using to wrap tools in his shed and had only recently unfolded and read properly. The article was short and tucked in the back pages and concerned itself with a report from the Royal Geographical Society's Australian branch about anomalous stone formations in the Wheat Belt region east of Perth. The report did not name any specific site, it did not describe a chamber, but it mentioned, almost in passing, that several sites of geological interest had been inspected by Commonwealth representatives in the early 1920s and had been determined not to warrant further study. Patterson thought Callaway should see it. Callaway read it twice and put it in the drawer with the photographs. By 1935, the drawer contained the photographs, the newspaper clipping, a hand-drawn map of the chamber's interior that Callaway had made from memory several months after the site was filled, a note from a retired school teacher in Northam named Agnes Whitfield, who had heard through a mutual acquaintance about Callaway's discovery and had written to say that she had once read an account in an old colonial journal of similar stone structures found in the southwest of the state in the 1890s, and a list of questions that Callaway had been writing down whenever they occurred to him. Questions he did not expect to answer himself, but that he wanted preserved in some form in case someone more capable of answering them ever came along. The questions were straightforward and they were good. Who built the chamber? When was it built? What were the markings on the wall? Why had the government closed the site without explanation? What had happened to the photographs the government men had taken? And one question that was harder than the rest, that Callaway wrote at the bottom of the list and underlined twice. What are they afraid people will find out? He died in 1954 without receiving answers to any of them. He left the envelope and its contents to his daughter, whose name was Ruth, with a handwritten note that said only that she should give it to someone who would know what to do with it and that she should be careful about who that was. Ruth Callaway was 41 years old when her father died, and she was not immediately sure what to do with the inheritance. She was a practical woman, a primary school teacher in a town called Merredin, and her instincts were not those of an archivist or a campaigner. For several years she kept the envelope in her own drawer and did not think about it often, but she was also a curious person, and the questions her father had written out had a way of surfacing when she least expected them, in the middle of lessons, on long drives, and the quiet of evenings after her own children were in bed. In 1961, she made her first serious attempt to find out what had happened. She wrote to the Department of Lands, she wrote to the Western Australian Museum, she wrote to the University of Western Australia. She was more specific than her father had been, naming the year, the approximate location, describing the photographs. She received 2 replies, one from the Department of Lands, which said that its records for site inspections conducted in the 1920s were incomplete and that it could find no record of the inspection her father had described. One from the museum, which said much the same thing. She did not write again for 4 years. When she did, in 1965, she wrote to a different address. She had read in an academic journal she had tracked down at the State Library in Perth, a paper by a geologist named Dr. Henry Broome of the University of Adelaide about anomalous structural features in Western Australian limestone country. The paper was dense and technical and not concerned with archaeology, but buried in its footnotes was a reference to prior surveys conducted by Commonwealth geological teams in the 1920s, and one of those surveys was located in a district that corresponded, roughly but unmistakably, with the area where her father's property had been. She wrote to Dr. Broom. He replied. His reply was cautious but not dismissive. He said that he was aware of references to prior surveys in the area she described, that the records of those surveys were held not by any university or museum, but by a Commonwealth agency, whose name and function had changed several times since the 1920s, and which was now, to the best of his knowledge, something called the Bureau of Mineral Resources. He said that access to those records was theoretically possible through a formal request, but that in his experience requests of that kind from non-governmental parties tended to produce either delays of extraordinary length or documents so heavily redacted as to be useless. He said, and this is the part Ruth Calloway read 3 times before putting the letter down, that he had heard through the informal networks of academic geology that exist in every field where interesting things happen in inconvenient places, vague references to a site of unusual character in the Wheat Belt region that had been assessed and closed in the early 1920s, and that the assessments in question were understood in a general and unverifiable way to have produced findings that did not conform to accepted geological or archaeological frameworks. He did not say what those findings were. He said he did not know precisely, and that even if he had known, he would have been uncertain about committing the information to a letter. He wished her well with her inquiries. Ruth Calloway put the letter in the envelope with the photographs and the newspaper clipping and the hand-drawn map and her father's list of questions, and she drove to Perth and spent 3 days at the State Library reading everything she could find about stone structures, pre-European settlement patterns in Western Australia, and the history of Commonwealth geological surveys conducted in the state between 1918 and 1930. She found very little that was directly useful, but she found 3 things that she would later describe as the moments when the shape of the story began to change for her. The first was a reference in an obscure colonial administration document from 1897 to an Aboriginal elder from the Noongar people in the southwest of the state who had told a surveyor of a place his people called, in translation, the House of the Old Ones, a structure of stone in the eastern country that had been there, he said, since before his people's memory began. The surveyor had noted this in passing and had not followed up. His primary concern was water access for pastoral leases. The remark sat in the document like a stone dropped in still water, making no ripples because no one had been looking for them. The second thing was a paragraph in a 1914 geological survey report that described in the dry language of survey reports an area of limestone country in the Wheat Belt district that exhibited what the surveyor called structural anomalies inconsistent with known cave formation processes. The surveyor had recommended further investigation. There was no record of further investigation having been conducted. The third thing she found was more difficult to categorize. In a collection of personal letters donated to the library by the family of a Perth solicitor who had died in the 1940s, there was a letter dated August 1923, the same year her father had found the chamber, from a man identified only by initials, writing to the solicitor about a matter of apparently sensitive nature. Most of the letter concerned legal and financial affairs that meant nothing to Ruth. But in the second paragraph, almost in passing, the writer mentioned that he had been asked by a contact in the department to assist in the arrangement of what he called a quiet settlement of a peculiar property matter in the wheat belt, and that the settlement had involved the signing of a document by the property holder acknowledging that the government had the right to manage any features of historical or geological significance found on his land. He found the whole business, the writer said, rather more secretive than the circumstances seemed to warrant, and he had been left with the impression that the people arranging it were more anxious than they were letting on. Edmund Calloway had never mentioned signing any such document. Ruth asked her mother, who was still living, if she remembered anything of the kind. Her mother said she did not, but that there had been a period in the autumn of 1923 when Edmund had been preoccupied in a way that was unusual for him, and that he had had several conversations with someone on the telephone that he had not discussed with her afterward. Ruth drove home from Perth with a different quality of certainty than she had arrived with. She did not know what her father had found. She did not know what the markings in the chamber meant. She did not know why the government had closed the site and buried the records. But she knew, with the particular clarity that comes from finding three separate threads that all pull toward the same point, that something had been hidden, deliberately, carefully, with enough forethought to involve a solicitor and a signed document and the removal of correspondence from institutional records. She was not sure yet what to do with that knowledge. She put it in the drawer with everything else, and she continued teaching children in Merredin, and she thought about it in the quiet evenings. The drawer did not stay closed for much longer. In 1968, Ruth's youngest son, whose name was Thomas, and who was studying archaeology at the University of Western Australia, came home for Christmas, and his mother showed him the envelope. Thomas Calloway was 22 years old and possessed of the particular combination of academic training and family loyalty that makes for a very motivated researcher. He spent the better part of 3 days going through everything in the envelope, asking his mother questions, making notes of his own. He took the photographs to a friend in the geology department who could analyze the stone type in the images. He made an appointment with an expert in ancient writing systems at the university. The appointment with the writing systems expert was a man named Dr. Paul Ashford, who had spent 20 years studying ancient scripts from the Middle East and Mediterranean. He looked at the photograph of the chamber wall for a long time without speaking. Then he asked Thomas where it had been taken. Thomas told him. Ashford looked at the photograph again. He said that the markings did not correspond to any writing system he could identify with certainty, which was in itself not necessarily significant, as there were many early and poorly documented scripts whose full character sets were not known. What was significant, he said, was the structural organization of the markings, the way they were arranged in what appeared to be rows, with regular spacing and consistent orientation, which was characteristic of deliberate written language rather than decorative or symbolic marking. He said that some of the individual characters bore what he could only describe as a family resemblance to certain forms found in very early Semitic scripts, which would be extraordinary given the location, and that he would need considerably better quality images to say anything more definitive. He asked Thomas if he could have the photograph for further study. Thomas said he would ask his mother. Ruth said no. She had a feeling she could not entirely articulate that the photograph should not leave the family's possession until they understood better what they were dealing with. Thomas thought this was overcautious. He was 22, and at 22, the idea that a government would suppress archaeological evidence seems paranoid rather than merely prudent. He and his mother disagreed about this for some time. Eventually, Ruth prevailed, as she usually did, and they compromised. Thomas would make a high-quality copy of the photograph and take that to Ashford instead. Ashford spent 3 months with the copy. When he came back to Thomas, he was quieter than before. He said that the more he studied the image, the more certain he became that what was depicted was a genuine writing system, not decorative markings, not natural formations, and not anything he could identify as belonging to any documented pre-colonial tradition in Australia. He said the structural patterns were consistent with a phonetic rather than ideographic system, which meant that the symbols represented sounds rather than concepts, and that the form suggested a script that had either evolved from or was closely related to a family of early alphabets whose origins lay in the ancient Near East. He paused at that point in the conversation, Thomas later recalled, and chose his next words with evident care. He said that if the photograph accurately represented what was on that wall, and if the chamber was genuinely pre-colonial and not some elaborate hoax, then what they were looking at was evidence of a contact event, a meeting between people from the ancient Near East and people in the interior of Western Australia, at a date that preceded any documented contact between those regions by what might be several thousand years. He said this was not impossible in the way that many people assumed it was impossible, that there was a long tradition of serious scholarship arguing that ancient maritime cultures were more capable of long-distance ocean travel than the mainstream historical consensus allowed for. He said, however, that evidence of such contact, if genuine, would be profoundly disruptive to a great many settled historical narratives, and that he had observed in his career that profoundly disruptive evidence had a way of encountering institutional resistance that bore no relationship to its scientific merit. He said he was telling Thomas this not to discourage him, but to prepare him. Thomas was not sure at that point whether to be excited or frightened. He was, in fact, both. And he went home and told his mother what Ashford had said, and Ruth sat in her kitchen for a long time without speaking, and then she said that she thought she understood now why the government had moved so quickly and so quietly in 1923, and that she thought they should be very careful about who else they told. She was right to be careful. What followed over the next decade was a pattern that anyone who has ever tried to investigate a genuinely suppressed piece of history will recognize. Not dramatic confrontation, not direct threats, just a persistent, grinding institutional difficulty that made every avenue of inquiry harder to pursue than it should have been. Thomas attempted to locate the site of his grandfather's property. The land had been sold several times since 1954, and its current boundaries did not correspond exactly to the maps in his grandfather's papers. The area where the chamber had been was on a section that had changed hands in 1969 and was now under a pastoral lease held by a company registered in South Australia. He wrote to the company. He did not receive a reply. He wrote to the Department of Lands asking for records of the property transfer. The records he received were incomplete in ways that seemed, to his trained eye, deliberate rather than accidental. Ashford attempted to publish a paper raising the question of the script as an area for further investigation, carefully worded, not asserting anything that could not be directly supported by the photographic evidence. It was rejected by 3 journals. two of the rejection letters were standard form communications. The third was a longer letter from an editor who, in an unusual display of candor, wrote that while the paper was well argued, the subject matter was likely to attract controversy, that the journal was not positioned to manage, and that the author might find a more sympathetic reception in publications less concerned with mainstream consensus. Ashford wrote back, asking the editor to specify what controversy he anticipated. He did not receive a reply. In 1972, Thomas connected through university networks with a researcher in Adelaide named Dr. Clara Hendricks, who had been studying evidence of pre-European contact in South Australia and who had encountered similar patterns of bureaucratic resistance. They began corresponding regularly. Hendricks had accumulated a file of several dozen cases from around Australia in which physical evidence of anomalous historical origin had been discovered, assessed by government representatives, and then effectively disappeared from the public record. The cases ranged across the continent. Some involved stone structures, some involved artifacts of apparent foreign origin, some involved what appeared to be ancient inscriptions. In almost every case, the pattern was the same: discovery, informal notification of authorities, government inspection, a brief period of uncertainty, and then a determination that the discovery was of no significant interest, followed by the disappearance of any official record of inspection. Hendricks had a theory about why this pattern existed, and it was more nuanced than simple malice or conspiracy. She believed that the suppression, to the extent that it was systematic rather than coincidental, arose from a particular intersection of interests: the legal framework governing Aboriginal land rights in Australia, which in the early 20th century was constructed around the doctrine of terra nullius, the idea that the land had been legally unoccupied before European settlement, depended critically on a particular understanding of Aboriginal history as nomadic and pre-structural. Evidence of permanent structures of indigenous origin disrupted that framework in obvious ways, but evidence of contact with ancient foreign cultures, she argued, was even more disruptive because it raised questions about trade, about navigation, about the existence of sophisticated networks of exchange that implied a level of human activity in the pre-colonial period that the terra nullius doctrine had no mechanism to accommodate. She was not arguing that Aboriginal people had not built the structures, or that contact with ancient Near Eastern cultures represented something other than or separate from Aboriginal history. She was arguing the opposite, that the attempt to deny or suppress evidence of complex pre-colonial activity in Australia was fundamentally an attempt to deny the complexity and sophistication of Aboriginal history, because acknowledging that history in its full dimensions would undermine the legal and political foundations of colonial land ownership. Thomas found this argument persuasive. He brought it to Ashford, who found it interesting but was more cautious about the specific claim of Near Eastern contact. Not because he thought it impossible, but because the photographic evidence, while suggestive, was not definitive, and he had spent enough time in academic controversy to know the difference between what a photograph suggested and what it proved. Ruth, when Thomas explained Hendricks's theory to her, said that she thought the woman was probably right and that she was not surprised. She was 60 years old by this point and had spent most of her adult life thinking about her father's drawer and what was in it. And she had long since arrived at the conclusion that the most dangerous thing in the Australian interior was not the heat or the distance or the wildlife, but the capacity of powerful institutions to make inconvenient things invisible. She said she thought the photograph should be lodged somewhere that was genuinely secure, somewhere that could not easily be interfered with. She asked Thomas what he thought that might be. Thomas thought about it for some weeks and then arranged for copies of the photographs, along with copies of all the other documents in the envelope, to be placed with the solicitor in Perth, with instructions that they be released to any credible researcher who requested them in the event that Ruth, Thomas, or any member of their immediate family died under unusual circumstances. He told his mother this, and she said that she thought it was probably excessive, and then said that she was glad he had done it. The years between 1973 and 1985 were, in terms of the active investigation, largely quiet. Thomas finished his degree, found work as a lecturer, published on topics that were not directly related to the chamber, but that kept him adjacent to the relevant scholarly debates. He continued corresponding with Hendricks, who continued building her file of anomalous discovery cases. Ashford retired from the university in 1979, but maintained his interest in the photographs and his cautious, careful attempts to place them in a broader scholarly context. What changed in 1985 was not any single dramatic event, but a slow accumulation of things that had changed in the wider world and that were beginning to affect how these questions could be asked. Aboriginal land rights were becoming a live political issue in Australia in ways they had not been for most of the century. The Mabo case, which would eventually overturn the doctrine of terra nullius, was still 7 years away, but the intellectual and legal groundwork for it was being laid, and the political atmosphere around questions of pre-colonial history was shifting. At the same time, a body of alternative historical scholarship was developing internationally. Work by researchers like Barry Fell in the United States and others elsewhere who were arguing, with varying degrees of rigor and success, that the ancient world had been far more connected by maritime trade than conventional history allowed. Some of this work was careful and some of it was not. Some of it was seized upon by people with agendas that had nothing to do with honest historical inquiry. And this is where the story of the Callaway Chamber enters territory that requires a certain kind of care, because the history of suppressed archaeological evidence exists in uncomfortable proximity to the history of archaeological fraud and motivated misinterpretation, and distinguishing between the two is not always straightforward. Thomas was aware of this. He had watched with a mixture of interest and alarm as alternative history became a popular genre in the 1980s, producing books that made dramatic claims about ancient contact, lost civilizations, and government cover-ups, some of which were based on evidence of genuine interest, and some of which were based on nothing at all. He was concerned that if he brought the Callaway photographs into public view in the wrong context, they would be absorbed into a discourse that would make serious investigation of them impossible. Legitimate researchers would be put off by the association with sensationalism. The government, if it was still monitoring the matter, would have easy grounds for dismissal. He discussed this with Hendricks, who had the same concerns about her own accumulated files. They agreed that the most useful thing they could do was to continue building the case methodically, within the frameworks of legitimate scholarship, until they had enough material to present it in a way that could not simply be brushed aside. In 1988, Thomas found something that he had not expected to find, and that changed the quality of the evidence available to him considerably. He had been working through 19th century colonial records at the State Archive in Perth, looking for any references to pre-colonial stone structures in the Wheat Belt region, when he came across a box of documents that had been catalogued simply as Miscellaneous Administrative Correspondence, Western Interior, 1890-1920. The box had apparently not been examined in a very long time. Several of the documents in it were duplicates of records that existed elsewhere in the archive. But near the bottom of the box, he found a folder that contained what appeared to be handwritten notes from a geological survey conducted in 1919, 4 years before his grandfather's discovery. The notes were difficult to read in places, their handwriting hasty, and the paper damaged by moisture at some point in the intervening decades. But they were legible enough to establish that the survey team had found, in the Wheat Belt district east of Perth, evidence of an underground chamber of apparent human construction. The notes described the structure in terms that matched Edmund Callaway's account almost exactly. Worked stone slabs, fitted joints, a chamber of substantial dimensions extending beneath the surface. The notes describe markings on the interior walls that the surveyor had attempted to sketch in the margin of the page. And while the sketches were rough, Thomas could see in them, unmistakably, the same general character forms that appeared in the 1923 photograph. The notes also described a conversation with a Noongar elder who had been accompanying the survey party as a guide. The elder had told the surveyor, through an interpreter, that the structure was known to his people, that it had been there since before the oldest stories began, and that it was considered a place of great significance, a meeting place between the world as his people knew it, and something older and further away. He had not been willing to say more than that, and the surveyor had recorded his account with an air of polite skepticism that was characteristic of the period. At the bottom of the last page of notes was a sentence written in a different hand, presumably added later by a supervisor or administrator, that read simply, "Matter referred to Commonwealth Authority. No further action to be taken." Thomas made copies of everything in the folder. He sent copies to Hendricks and to Ashford, who was by this point in his 80s and not well but still intellectually alert. Ashford wrote back within a week. He said that the 1919 sketches, rough as they were consistent enough with what he could see in the 1923 photograph to make him considerably more confident that what was depicted was genuine, and that the two independent records of the same structure, made 4 years apart by different observers who could not have been in contact with each other, significantly strengthened the case for authenticity. He said he thought it was time for the whole matter to be brought into the open. Thomas was not sure he agreed. He was aware that the archive discovery had been accidental, that the folder had survived apparently because it had been misfiled rather than because anyone had decided to preserve it, and that its survival was therefore not necessarily indicative of how much similar material had survived elsewhere. He wanted to find more before he moved. He found more, though it came in smaller pieces and from less expected directions. In 1990, a retired surveyor named George Milne contacted Thomas after hearing through a network of retired government employees about his interest in historical surveys of the Wheat Belt region. Milne was 78 years old and had worked for the Department of Lands from 1935 to 1972. He said he had something Thomas might find interesting and that he preferred to discuss it in person. Thomas drove to Milne's home in Rockingham, south of Perth. Milne was a small, precise man who offered tea before producing from a locked box in his study, a document that he said he had retained against regulations but with a clear conscience, because he had believed at the time and continued to believe that it ought to exist somewhere outside the government's filing system. The document was a memorandum dated 1948, addressed to the director of the Bureau of Mineral Resources from a government archaeologist named Dr. Martin Elwood. Elwood's memorandum described an inspection he had conducted in 1947 of a site in the Wheat Belt district that had been brought to the Bureau's attention following inquiries from a member of the public. The site, he wrote, corresponded to the location of a previously assessed structure whose records were held in restricted files under a reference number he provided. His inspection had been intended to determine whether the structure had been disturbed or exposed by recent agricultural activity. He had found that the site had been filled as directed in 1923 and showed no surface evidence of the underlying structure. However, he had taken the opportunity to conduct ground surveys and had found that the structure extended considerably further than the original 1923 assessment had suggested, and that what had been sealed was in fact only a small portion of a much larger complex of chambers and passages beneath the surface. He recommended further detailed investigation and noted that the wall markings documented in the 1923 photographs, which he had reviewed in the restricted files, were of a character that, in his professional opinion, warranted expert analysis by someone with specific knowledge of ancient scripts. He named 3 scholars, one in Britain and 2 in the United States, whose expertise he considered relevant. There was a handwritten notation at the bottom of Elwood's memorandum. It was not signed. It said, "Recommendation not approved, restricted status to be maintained, file to be reviewed in 10 years. Milne said he did not know what had happened at the 10-year review, if one had occurred. He had come across the memorandum in 1972 while clearing out files that were being transferred to a new storage facility, and he had kept it because he had thought even then that it was the kind of thing that should not simply disappear. He had kept it for 18 years without knowing quite what to do with it. He had Thomas's name from a colleague and thought perhaps Thomas was the right person to have it now. Thomas thanked him and drove home with the memorandum on the passenger seat of his car, and the particular feeling of someone who has been handed a piece of a puzzle that makes all the other pieces fit together differently than they had before, because what Milne's document established, beyond what was already known, was not just that the site had been sealed in 1923 and the records restricted. It established that in 1947, a qualified government archaeologist had inspected the site, had assessed it as significantly more extensive than originally documented, had recommended expert investigation and had been overruled, and then, apparently, nothing further had happened. The restricted file had sat in the Bureau's archives for 40 years, seen by no one except the people who had decided it should be seen by no one. Thomas spent the following 2 years doing what he should perhaps have done earlier, which was to attempt a formal access request for the restricted file Elwood had referenced. He went through proper channels. He engaged a solicitor who specialized in freedom of information matters. The process was, as Dr. Broom had predicted nearly 30 years before, extraordinarily slow and produced documents that were heavily redacted. But it produced some documents, and in those documents, around the edges of the redactions, certain things were visible that had not been visible before. The photographs taken by the government men in 1923 still existed. They were referenced in the file with registry numbers, though the photographs themselves were not included in the material released. The 1919 survey notes existed in a more complete form than the misfiled copy Thomas had found in the archive, and the additional material in the complete version included a series of measurements and sketches that had not been in the misfiled copy. There was a chain of correspondence between 1923 and 1930 that the redactions had reduced to fragments, but the fragments were enough to establish that the site had been discussed at senior levels within the Commonwealth administration, and that the discussions had involved not only geological and archaeological considerations, but legal ones, specifically around the question of what the discovery implied for land title in the region. And there was a reference in a document from 1929 that was less heavily redacted than most of the others, to a consultation conducted in that year with an unnamed expert from an unnamed institution who had examined the photographs of the wall markings and had produced a written assessment. The assessment itself was not included. What was included was a summary of it in one sentence. The examiner concluded that the markings were consistent with a script of Near Eastern origin and recommended immediate further investigation of the site and of the broader region. The recommendation had not been acted upon. Thomas published a paper in 1993, the 70th anniversary of his grandfather's discovery. He was careful with it, careful in the way that Ashford had taught him to be, making no claims that went beyond what the evidence directly supported, presenting the case as one that warranted further investigation rather than one whose conclusions were already established. He published it in a journal of Australian history that was respected but not the most prestigious in its field. He included reproductions of the 1923 photographs, the 1919 survey sketches, and excerpts from the documents recovered through Freedom of Information, with a factual account of the redactions and their extent. The response was not what he had hoped for and not what he had feared. It was not suppressed. It was not dramatically attacked. It was reviewed in 2 journals, politely but without great enthusiasm, and cited in a small number of subsequent papers on Australian prehistoric history. It generated some correspondence from researchers who had encountered similar patterns in different parts of the country. It did not generate the kind of broad, scholarly engagement that might have led to a new investigation of the site. It did, however, do one thing that Thomas had not anticipated. It came to the attention of an Aboriginal elder from the Noongar community named Raymond Walgar, who had spent 40 years as a keeper of his community's oral traditions, and who had known all his life about the place his people called the House of the Old Ones. Walgar contacted Thomas through the university. They met in Perth in the spring of 1994. The meeting lasted most of a day, and it changed the shape of everything Thomas understood about what his grandfather had found, because Walgar knew things that were not in any of the documents. He knew them because they had been passed down through his community's oral tradition in the careful, structured way that such knowledge is preserved in cultures where memory is the only archive, layer upon layer of story and ceremony and direct instruction from elder to successor, maintained over periods of time that make written history look brief. Walgar told Thomas that his people's knowledge of the chamber, the House of the Old Ones, went back to before any of his community's remembered history of European contact. It was known as a place that had been made by people who had come from the sea, from a direction that corresponded to the northwest in a time that the oldest stories described as when the water was different, which Wolga understood to refer to a period when sea levels had been significantly lower than they were now, a period that would place the stories well before the end of the last ice age, which was 12,000 years ago at minimum. He said his people had always known that the marks on the walls of the chamber were not their own marks, not made by his ancestors, but made by the visitors who had built the structure, and that his people had maintained knowledge of the site across all the intervening centuries, not as owners of it, but as witnesses to it, as the people who had been there when it was built and who had agreed to remember. He said that the people who had come from the sea had not stayed. They had come, they had built, they had been there for some period that the stories did not specify precisely, and then they had gone back the way they had come and had not returned. But they had left the structure, and they had, according to the stories, left something inside it deeper than the outer chamber, in a part of the complex that had not been opened in any of the inspections that Thomas knew about. He said he was telling Thomas this because he believed that what had been taken from his people, the dismissal of their knowledge, the suppression of the site, the erasure of their testimony from the official record, deserved to be corrected, and that the only way to correct it was to bring the full truth into the open. He said he was also telling him because he was old, and the line of succession for this particular knowledge was fragile, and he did not want it lost. Thomas asked Wolgar if he could speak with other members of the community who held this knowledge. Wolgar said he would arrange it with appropriate consideration for what was appropriate to share outside the community. Over the following 3 years, Thomas worked with Wolgar and 2 other Noongar elders to document in as much detail as was considered appropriate and respectful the oral tradition surrounding the site. He brought in an anthropologist named Dr. Sarah Ngada, who specialized in Aboriginal oral histories and whose work Thomas trusted, and together they produced a paper that wove together the documentary evidence from the archive investigation, the photographic evidence from the Callaway family collection, and the Noongar oral tradition into a single account. The paper was more ambitious than Thomas's 1993 piece, and its claims were more substantial. It argued that the weight of evidence taken together supported 3 conclusions. First, that a stone chamber of human construction, of unknown but apparently pre-European origin, existed in the Wheat Belt district east of Perth. Second, that this structure had been known to Noongar people for a period of time that the oral tradition suggested was measured in thousands rather than hundreds of years. Third, that the markings on the interior walls of the chamber were consistent with a script of possible Near Eastern origin, and that this consistency, combined with the Noongar oral tradition's account of visitors from the sea, raised serious questions about the extent of ancient maritime contact that deserved proper scientific investigation. The paper was submitted to 3 journals. It was rejected by all 3. One of the rejection letters was from a journal editor whose response went into some detail about the paper's shortcomings. The editor said that the paper relied too heavily on oral tradition as evidence, that the photographic evidence was insufficient to support the conclusions drawn about the script, and that the suppression of documents by government agencies, while documented, could be explained by administrative incompetence rather than deliberate concealment. He said the paper would need substantial revision before it was suitable for publication. Ungata, who had more experience of academic rejection than Thomas, said that the editor's letter was actually useful because it identified precisely the points at which the standard academic framework was resistant to the kind of evidence they were presenting. Oral tradition, she said, was not considered acceptable evidence in mainstream archaeological scholarship in Australia in a way that it was beginning to be accepted in anthropological scholarship, and that this gap was itself a political problem, not just an academic one, because it meant that the evidentiary standards being applied to Aboriginal historical knowledge were systematically different from those applied to documentary historical knowledge. Thomas said he understood this but was not sure what to do about it in the short term. He was beginning to feel the weight of the years and the accumulated resistance, and his mother, who was now in her 80s and whose health had been declining since the early 1990s, was asking him increasingly often whether he thought the truth would ever come out. Ruth Calloway died in 2001 at the age of 88. In her will, she left the original photographs and documents to Thomas, with instructions that they be digitized and preserved in multiple secure locations. She also left a letter to Thomas that described, in her careful teacher's handwriting, her understanding of why the truth had not come out and her hope that it eventually would. She wrote that she had thought about her father's question for most of her adult life. The one at the bottom of his list that he had underlined twice, what are they afraid people will find out? She said she thought she knew the answer by now, and that it was not simply about land rights or legal frameworks, though those were part of it. She thought the deeper fear was of what it would mean for the story that Australia told about itself, the story of a continent that had been essentially empty, historically speaking, before Europeans arrived. A stone chamber built to last, fitted with precision, marked with writing connected by oral tradition to a maritime contact event thousands of years before European settlement. That was not a detail that could be accommodated within that story. It was a different story entirely, and the country had not yet, she thought, developed the capacity to bear a different story. She hoped Thomas would help it develop that capacity. She said she believed he was closer than he knew. In the years after Ruth's death, several things happened simultaneously that began to shift the landscape in which the Calloway Chamber evidence existed. The broader scholarly conversation about ancient maritime contact and pre-Columbian history was changing in ways that made the territory less exotic. Genetic research was beginning to produce evidence of ancient population movements that conventional historical models could not easily account for. Studies of Aboriginal Australian DNA published in the early 2000s were revealing connections to ancient populations in South Asia and elsewhere that suggested the continent's human history was considerably more complex than the simple model of isolation following initial settlement had implied. None of this directly addressed the Calloway Chamber, but it created a scholarly environment in which the idea of ancient contact was less automatically dismissible than it had been in 1993. At the same time, the legal and political landscape around Aboriginal history in Australia had changed significantly since Mabo. The recognition of native title had created both a new framework for acknowledging the complexity of pre-colonial history and new practical incentives for governments to manage carefully what that history was understood to contain. The result was a somewhat paradoxical situation in which Aboriginal oral tradition was increasingly acknowledged in legal and political contexts, while remaining resistant in many academic ones. Thomas, now in his late 50s, had spent enough time in the relevant academic and political networks to understand both the opportunities and the constraints in this changed landscape. He had continued corresponding with researchers in Australia and internationally who were working on related questions. He had connected with scholars in Israel, in Lebanon, in Malta, who were studying ancient Phoenician navigation and who had their own reasons for being interested in what the furthest extent of ancient maritime contact might have been. He had worked with Noongar community members to develop a formal proposal for a new investigation of the site that would be conducted under Aboriginal heritage protocols and would engage the Noongar people as partners rather than subjects. The proposal for a new investigation was submitted to the relevant government agencies in 2004. It named the site location as precisely as the available evidence allowed, referenced the documented history of prior inspections and their outcomes, described the evidentiary basis for believing the site warranted investigation, and requested access to the still restricted government files relating to the 1923 and subsequent assessments. The response from the government came 8 months later. It was polite and thorough, and it said no to almost everything. The restricted files could not be released because they contained information, the continued protection of which was required under Commonwealth security legislation, the specific provisions of which were not specified. The site itself was under a pastoral lease whose terms did not permit the kind of survey being proposed. The government welcomed continued engagement with Aboriginal communities on heritage matters and referred Thomas to an existing program for that purpose. Thomas's solicitor wrote back with a series of detailed questions about each of these points. The solicitor received detailed responses to some of them. He did not receive responses to the specific questions about why materials gathered in a geological survey conducted 80 years ago were still classified under security legislation. The investigation did not proceed in 2004. It did not proceed in 2005 or 2006 either. What happened in 2007 was not a government decision, it was a flood. The Wheatbelt region of Western Australia experiences periodic heavy rainfall events, and in the winter of 2007, one of unusual severity moved through the area east of Perth. The property on which the Callaway farm had originally stood had by this point been through several changes of ownership, and was no longer primarily agricultural in the original sense. The current leaseholder was a company that ran a combination of pastoral and mineral exploration operations. The flood, as the 923 rain had done 84 years before, caused significant ground movement in certain areas, and in one corner of the property, in an area that corresponded, according to the map Thomas had from his grandfather's hand-drawn record, to the location of the original collapse, the earth moved again. The leaseholder's operations manager, a man named David Strachan, noticed it during a routine site check and photographed it on his phone. He sent the photographs to his company's head office in Adelaide. Someone at the head office, doing some basic due diligence, ran a search on the property and found Thomas's 1993 paper. Strachan received an instruction from his head office to leave the area undisturbed and to make no further reports on it, and to direct anyone who inquired to the head office. He did not follow this instruction in its entirety. He had a friend who worked in local heritage management, and he sent the photographs to her quietly, saying only that he thought someone should know. She recognized what she was looking at, and she called Thomas. Thomas drove to the property within 48 hours. He could not get permission to go onto the land, but he could get close enough from an adjacent access road to see that what the photograph showed was real. Another collapse, another exposure. A gap in the earth that showed at its edge the corner of something that was not rock in any natural formation sense. Something worked. He called Wolgar, who was in his 80s by this point and could not travel easily, but who spent a long time on the telephone with Thomas, discussing what it meant. Walgar said that in his community's tradition, there was a belief that the house of the old ones would make itself known again when the time was right, and that the time being right was not something that humans decided. He said he thought Thomas should trust that the evidence would eventually find its way to people who could do something with it, and that the most important thing now was to make sure there was a proper record. Thomas made a proper record. He documented the photographs Strachan had taken, their provenance and date, and the geographical correspondence between the collapse location and the site described in the 1923 and 1919 records. He compiled everything: his grandfather's photographs, the archived documents, Elwood's memorandum, the oral tradition documentation from the 1990s work with Wolgar, the Freedom of Information materials, all of it, into a single comprehensive file that he lodged with the State Archive under an agreement that ensured its public availability, and with copies at 2 universities and in the digital record of a historical society. Then he published, not in an academic journal this time, but in a format that was less easy to simply not respond to. He worked with a journalist named Helen Price, who specialized in investigations of government historical records, and together they produced a long account of the Callaway Chamber, the evidence for its existence and significance, and the documented history of its suppression that was published in a serious long-form publication and was impossible to dismiss as fringe scholarship because it cited primary sources throughout and made no claims that went beyond what those sources supported. The response this time was different, not dramatically different. There was no government announcement, no release of the restricted files, no new investigation immediately proposed, but there was coverage in news media and in academic circles that created a different kind of record. Researchers who had encountered similar cases in other parts of Australia wrote to Thomas and to Price. A historian who had been researching the history of Commonwealth geological surveys from the early 20th century contacted them with additional documentation that supported the pattern they had described. The Noongar community issued a formal statement asserting its knowledge of and connection to the site, and the government did something it had not done before. It acknowledged that the site existed. Not that the Callaway family had been right all along, not that the evidence was significant, not that the restricted files should be released. But in response to a parliamentary question prompted by the publication, a minister's office issued a statement confirming that the site had been assessed in 1923, that the assessment records were classified under provisions of heritage and security legislation, and that the government was open to consulting with relevant Aboriginal communities on matters of cultural heritage significance. It was a very small acknowledgement, but it was the first one in nearly 90 years. Raymond Walgar died in 2009, 2 years after the flood and 1 year after the parliamentary acknowledgement. He had spent his last years working with younger community members to ensure that the oral tradition surrounding the house of the old ones was fully documented and securely held, in formats that could not be as easily lost as earlier records had been. He had also, in the year before his death, been part of a ceremony at the site that he described to Thomas afterward in terms that Thomas, a careful academic not given to mystical language, chose not to include in any published account, but which stayed with him for the rest of his life. Walgar said that the ceremony had been a recognition, not of ownership and not of resolution, but of continuity. His people had been witnesses to the house of the old ones for as long as their stories went back. They would continue to be witnesses. Whatever was in the deeper chambers, whatever the visitors from the sea had left there, whatever the marks on the walls meant in the full grammar of the script they were written in, all of that was still present, still waiting. The earth had kept it for however many thousands of years it had been there, and the earth would continue to keep it until the time came for it to be known. Thomas found this both comforting and deeply frustrating, as a temperament like his tends to find things that cannot be resolved by research and documentation. He was 63 years old in 2009, and he was tired in the particular way of someone who has spent most of his working life on a task that is not yet finished, and he was not certain he would live to see it finished. He had students now who had become colleagues, researchers who had taken up aspects of the work, a network of people who were continuing in various ways the project that had begun with his grandfather, standing at the edge of a muddy depression on an autumn morning in 1923. He published a book in 2012 that brought together the full account of everything that was then known. The evidence, the suppression, the oral tradition, the pattern of similar cases across Australia and elsewhere in the world. The book was not a bestseller. It was not intended to be. It was a scholarly work with extensive footnotes and source citations, and its intended audience was the people who would decide, eventually, whether another investigation of the site was conducted and what that investigation would be permitted to find. The book received several academic reviews. Two of them were dismissive of the claims about ancient Near Eastern contact on the grounds that the photographic evidence was insufficient. One of them engaged seriously with the documentary evidence of suppression and called it a significant contribution to Australian administrative history. One was written by an archaeologist who had worked extensively in the Middle East and who said, in measured language that nonetheless managed to be quite clear, that the script evidence in the photographs was the most interesting material he had encountered in a decade of studying ancient writing systems, and that the failure to investigate it properly was an embarrassment to Australian scholarship. The restricted files are still classified. The site is still under a pastoral lease whose terms limit access. The photographs Edmund Callaway took in 1923 are in the State Archive, available to any researcher who requests them. The wall markings they depict have not been formally studied by any government-sponsored investigation. The deeper chambers that Elwood described in his 1947 memorandum, the ones that had not been opened in any of the inspections that are part of the documented record, have not, as far as anyone outside the restricted files knows, been entered or examined. Thomas Callaway is in his late 70s now. He still corresponds with researchers working on related questions. He has continued with the Noongar community to press for a proper investigation of the site conducted under appropriate heritage protocols. He has not given up on the restricted files, and the Freedom of Information requests continue at intervals, each one producing slightly more than the last, each one finding the redaction slightly less comprehensive than the previous attempt. The question his grandfather wrote at the bottom of the list and underlined twice, "What are they afraid people will find out?" has not been answered in any definitive sense. But in the decades of work that followed from that unanswered question, a great deal has become clear that was not clear before. We know now, or we know well enough to say with confidence, that the chamber exists, that it is not a natural formation, that it is not a product of European settlement, that it has been known to the Noongar people for a period of time that extends beyond any documented history of contact with the outside world. We know that people who looked at the markings on its walls at different times and with different levels of expertise consistently found them to bear a resemblance to scripts from the ancient Near East. We know that the government of Australia, from the earliest days of the discovery, treated the site as something that should be managed carefully and kept from public knowledge, and that this management was sufficiently thorough and sustained over long enough a period to involve the classified filing of evidence, the suppression of expert recommendations, and the legal management of a farmer who had simply wanted to know what he had found on his own land. We do not know what the markings say. We do not know who made them or when or exactly how they came to be in the interior of Western Australia. We do not know what is in the deeper chambers that Elwood described in 1947. We do not know why, in all the decades since 1923, no one with the power to open those chambers and properly study what they contain has exercised that power, and no one with the power to force such a study has chosen to do so. What we know is that the questions are still there. Written on the walls of a sealed chamber in a script no one has been properly permitted to read, held in the memory of a community that has watched the house of the old ones for longer than any written record can measure, and sitting in the drawer of a family that has been keeping faith with an unanswered question for 100 years. Edmund Callaway stood at the edge of that depression in August 1923 and saw something he did not understand. He tried to tell someone about it. He was told that it was nothing significant. He kept the photographs anyway because he was a methodical man who had walked that ground all his life, and he trusted what his own eyes had seen. He was right to trust them. That much we know. The rest is still waiting to be found out. There is a particular thing that happens when you carry a story this long. It stops being about the original discovery and starts being about the weight of the carrying. Edmund Callaway carried the photographs in a drawer for 30 years. Ruth carried them in a drawer for longer still, and then in her mind for the rest of her life after she had given the physical objects to Thomas. Thomas has carried the entire accumulation of evidence and effort and frustration and small incremental progress for more than 50 years, and he is still carrying it, and there are younger researchers now who are beginning to carry parts of it alongside him. This is not unique to this story. It is, in fact, the shape that suppressed history almost always takes. Not a dramatic confrontation between truth and power that resolves itself cleanly in one direction or the other. Not a revelation that changes everything overnight. Just a long, patient, generational effort to preserve what is known and build carefully toward what is not yet known in the face of institutional resistance that is itself generational and patient and in no particular hurry. The soil of the wheat belt is red. The salmon gum trees that Edmund Callaway used as landmarks in 1923 are still standing, because salmon gums live for centuries and do not care about the administrative decisions of governments. The earth above the chamber has settled back into itself, as earth does, and from the surface there is nothing to see. But the stone is still down there. The markings are still on the walls. The deeper chambers that have not been opened are still unopened. And somewhere in the Noongar community, the knowledge that Raymond Walger spent his life preserving and passing on is still alive. held by the people who agreed in a time before written records to remember. They have kept that agreement across all the intervening centuries. They are still keeping it. That is, in its way, the most remarkable part of the whole account. Not the stone chamber, extraordinary as that is. Not the suppressed government files, disturbing as their suppression is. But the fact that a community of people made a decision to hold on to a piece of knowledge, to protect it and transmit it, and refuse to let it be lost, for a period of time that dwarfs anything that the government's classified filing system has managed to maintain. The oldest and most reliable archive in this story is the human one. The memory that passes from elder to student across fires and ceremonies across thousands of years. There is something in that which the rest of us might consider carefully, because the house of the old ones is still there. And the old ones, whoever they were and wherever they came from, built it to last. They chose their stone well, and they fitted it with care, and they mark their walls with words that have not yet been read. They left something, according to the oldest stories, in the deepest chambers, and they built it in a place where it would be kept, not just by the stone, but by the people who were there when it was built and who agreed to remember. 100 years is a long time. It is also, in the scale of what we are talking about, not very long at all. The question is still there, underlined twice at the bottom of a farmer's handwritten list. What are they afraid people will find out? The answer, when it comes, will not be a small one. Let me tell you about the broader pattern, because the Callaway Chamber does not exist in isolation. It is one point in a constellation of discoveries across Australia and across the ancient world that together describe a picture that the conventional historical narrative has not yet found a way to accommodate, and that a great many people with institutional interests in the conventional narrative have worked, with varying degrees of success, to ensure remains scattered and unconnected and therefore easy to dismiss piece by piece. The scholar Dr. Clara Hendricks, who corresponded with Thomas Callaway from the 1970s onward, and who spent her career building a file of anomalous discovery cases from across the continent, identified by the time of her death in 2006 more than 60 separate instances in which physical evidence of possible pre-colonial contact or construction had been found, assessed by government representatives, and then effectively removed from public knowledge. She was careful to say that not all 60 cases were equally compelling, that some might have innocent explanations that she had not been able to access, that the documentation for some was thinner than for others. But she was also clear that the pattern itself, 60 cases following the same basic shape across a period of nearly a century and a continent-wide geography, was not something that could be explained by administrative incompetence or coincidence. The cases fell into several rough categories. There were stone structure cases, of which Callaway's was the most extensively documented. There were inscription cases, sites where markings on rock faces or stone surfaces had been found and then officially determined to be natural formations or Aboriginal art without expert analysis being conducted. There were artifact cases, objects recovered from contexts that suggested they had been deposited before European contact, which had been assessed and then placed in restricted collections or disappeared from institutional records. And there were what Hendricks called oral tradition suppression cases, instances in which Aboriginal community knowledge of specific sites or events had been formally documented by government representatives and then treated as sensitive information that was not to be circulated. The geographic spread of these cases was itself informative. They were not concentrated in any single region. They appeared in Queensland, in South Australia, in New South Wales, in the Northern Territory, as well as in Western Australia. They appeared in coastal areas and in the deep interior. They involved structures and inscriptions that, in the cases where expert opinion had been sought, were attributed to various possible sources, some to possible Aboriginal construction of a kind more permanent and elaborate than the conventional narrative allowed for, some to possible contact with maritime cultures from various parts of the ancient world. This was the most politically and academically sensitive aspect of Hendricks' work, and it is worth spending some time on it because it touches on questions that are themselves complex and that have often been handled badly by people on all sides. The question of ancient maritime contact with Australia is not, despite the way it is sometimes presented, an inherently colonial or racist one. The idea that ancient peoples, including Aboriginal Australians, might have had connections to other cultures across the ocean is not incompatible with Aboriginal history or Aboriginal agency. In fact, some Aboriginal communities have their own oral traditions that speak explicitly of contact with people from other places, and some researchers in the Aboriginal heritage community have been among the most vocal advocates for proper investigation of sites that might document such contact. The problem arises when the question of ancient contact is appropriated by people who are interested in it, not because it illuminates Aboriginal history, but because it is thought to diminish it. People who believe that any evidence of external contact with pre-colonial Australia somehow implies that Aboriginal people were not the original inhabitants or were not capable of the structures and achievements that the evidence documents. This is a misuse of the evidence that responsible scholars reject entirely. Hendricks' position was clear, and Thomas Callaway has consistently held the same position. The evidence of ancient contact, if it exists, documents a chapter of Aboriginal history. The people who were in Australia when contact occurred, who built or facilitated the construction of the structures that survive, who maintain the oral traditions that describe the contact, are Aboriginal people. Their history is not diminished by complexity, it is enriched by it. The narrative that diminishes Aboriginal history is not the one that acknowledges ancient contact. It is the one that denies it was possible, because that denial is built on an assumption of Aboriginal isolation and limitation that is itself colonial in its origins. The suppression of evidence like the Callaway chamber photographs on this reading is not simply a cover-up of inconvenient history in a neutral sense. It is a specific and ongoing act of erasure directed at the full complexity of Aboriginal history, conducted in the service of legal and political frameworks that continue to benefit from a diminished understanding of what that history contains. This is a hard thing to say plainly, and it is a harder thing to prove in the specific sense that courts and administrations require proof. But the accumulation of cases that Hendricks documented and the pattern of response to them that is visible in the government records that have been accessible make it difficult to avoid the conclusion that this is what has been happening. Let us go back to the chamber itself, because there is one aspect of it that has not yet been discussed fully, and that may be the most important of all. In all the accounts of the site, from Callaway's original description through the 1919 survey notes to Elwood's 1947 memorandum, the part of the structure that is described most consistently is the outer chamber, the part that was exposed by the original 1923 collapse and subsequently photographed and then filled. What is less consistently described, and what most of the public record barely acknowledges, is the deeper part of the complex. Elwood was the most specific about it. His 1947 memorandum described ground surveys that indicated the structure extended considerably further than the outer chamber, in the form of passages and additional chambers that had not been exposed by either the original collapse or the subsequent filling. He did not claim to have entered these passages. He described them on the basis of survey methodology, which in 1947 was less precise than modern techniques, but was adequate to establish the existence of substantial void space beneath the surface. The Noongar oral tradition that Wolgar shared with Thomas in 1994 also spoke of the deeper parts of the structure. Wolgar was careful about what he shared, and the full detail of the oral knowledge relating to the deeper chambers was not something he was in a position to make public, because that knowledge was held within ceremonial frameworks that governed its transmission and use. But he was willing to say in general terms that the tradition described the visitors from the sea as having left something in the interior of the structure before they departed, something that the tradition described as intended to be found at a later time, when the understanding necessary to read it correctly was present. He was not specific about what this meant. He said that he thought it probably did not mean a physical object in the straightforward sense, or not only that, and that the tradition's description of it was better understood as a kind of knowledge of a particular kind preserved in a particular form. He thought the marks on the outer chamber walls were part of it, a key of sorts, and that the deeper chambers might hold more of the same, more writing, more records, a fuller version of whatever the outer chamber was only the beginning of. Thomas, who had spent decades thinking about what ancient Near Eastern scripts were for, and how ancient people used writing to preserve and transmit information, found this reading plausible. Writing systems in the ancient world were not primarily for administrative record keeping in the narrow sense that the word record suggests to modern ears. They were technologies for the preservation and transmission of knowledge across time, across death, across the distances that separated communities. The oldest writing we have found is dedicated to things that mattered enough to be preserved: religious texts, astronomical observations, maps, accounts of journeys, descriptions of places and peoples encountered in the course of those journeys. If people had crossed the ocean in the ancient world and reached Australia, and if they had built a structure that was intended to last, and if they had marked that structure with their writing, it is reasonable to assume that what they wrote was something they considered worth preserving, not administrative notes, not casual graffiti, something they wanted to survive them and to be found by people who came after. The question of what it says, if that is what it is the question that has haunted everyone who has been close to this evidence for 100 years. Edmund Calloway asked it, standing in his paddock. Ruth Calloway asked it in her kitchen in Merredin in the evenings. Thomas Calloway has asked it every day of his working life. Ashford asked it. Hendricks asked it. Wolgar, in his own way and from within his own tradition, asked it, though his tradition already held part of the answer in a form that no one who was not initiated could access. The answer is still sealed, still down there in the red earth of the wheat belt, in the deeper chambers that have not been opened, in the writing on walls that no expert with the knowledge and equipment to read them properly has been permitted to examine. This is what is lost every year that passes without investigation. Not just the possibility of an answer to an academic question about ancient maritime contact, but an entire dimension of understanding about what human beings have been doing on this planet for far longer than the conventional historical narrative allows. About how connected the ancient world was, about how far people could travel and what they took with them and what they left behind, about the depth and reach of cultures that we have barely begun to understand, and what is preserved against all the odds of time and institutional resistance is remarkable in its own right. The photographs still exist, the documents still exist, the oral tradition still exists, held by a community that has kept faith with its agreement to remember across a period of time that makes the government's 100-year classification look like a brief interruption. The knowledge of what is there and the insistence that it matters has survived. Edmund Callaway kept the photographs because he trusted what his own eyes had seen. The Noongar people kept the memory because they understood that some things are too important to be lost, even when the world around you does not want them to be remembered. Ruth Callaway held the evidence in her drawer and asked quietly and persistently for most of her life, for someone to look at it properly. Thomas Callaway built from all of these things a record that cannot now be simply made to disappear, and a case that cannot simply be dismissed. What has not happened yet is the thing that needs to happen. The opening of the site, the study of the wall markings, the exploration of the deeper chambers, the release of the restricted files, the full accounting of what the government has known and done since 1923. But here is what is also true. The ground moves when the rain is heavy enough. It moved in 1923. It moved in 2007. It will move again. The stone is still there, and the earth does not hold things forever against the weight of water and time. What is the furthest reach of the ancient world? That is the question behind all the others. When we ask about the Callaway Chamber, about the marks on its walls, about the visitors from the sea that the Noongar oral tradition describes, we are asking a version of this question that is specific to one place and one discovery. But the question itself is one of the oldest and most important in human history. Because the answer to how far ancient people could travel determines the answer to everything else we think we know about the past. If the conventional limits are correct, if ancient maritime cultures could not sustain ocean voyages of the length that would be required to reach Australia from the Near East, then the Callaway Chamber cannot be what the evidence suggests it is, and some other explanation must be found. But if those limits are not correct, if ancient people were capable of things that our models have not yet accounted for, then the Callaway Chamber is not an anomaly. It is a data point, one of many. And the picture they describe together is a different past than the one we have been taught to see. The evidence that ancient maritime cultures were more capable of long-distance ocean travel than the conventional historical consensus has allowed is itself substantial and growing, and it comes from multiple directions that are independent of each other. There is the genetic evidence, which in the last 2 decades has produced findings that conventional models of human migration cannot easily accommodate. Studies of Aboriginal Australian DNA have found connections to ancient South Asian populations that appear to be older than the conventional models allow. Studies of populations in South America have found traces of Polynesian genetic material that predate European contact by centuries. Studies of Pacific Island populations have found patterns of genetic diversity that suggest multiple waves of migration from multiple directions, some of which do not correspond to any documented contact event. There is the linguistic evidence, which has been accumulating slowly for decades, but which has produced a series of findings that suggest ancient contact between geographically separated cultures. The identification of possible loan words in Australian Aboriginal languages from Dravidian languages of southern India, published by linguists who were careful about their methodology and who acknowledged the work as preliminary and contested, is one such finding. It is not definitive, but it is not nothing. There is the archaeological evidence from other parts of the world, the documented cases of ancient artifacts found in contexts that suggest long-distance maritime contact, the coins and pottery and tools that turn up in places where conventional history says they cannot be. Some of these cases are frauds, some are misidentifications, but not all of them are, and the pattern of genuine anomalies is large enough and consistent enough to suggest that the conventional limits on ancient maritime capability are drawn too conservatively. And there is the evidence of ancient navigation itself, the study of traditional navigation techniques from Pacific and Indian Ocean cultures that has demonstrated capabilities far beyond what early maritime historians assumed. The Polynesian expansion into the Pacific, which is not contested, and which required sustained open ocean voyaging across thousands of kilometers, was accomplished with vessels and navigation techniques that are, in their fundamental principles, available to any culture with the necessary knowledge and will. The question is not whether the technology existed in principle. The question is how widely it was distributed and how far it was applied. These are still open questions, but they are more open and the answers are less settled than the standard historical curriculum would suggest. This matters for the Callaway Chamber because the most common objection to taking it seriously, the claim that it cannot be what the evidence suggests because ancient people could not have gotten there, is less secure than it appears. It is not an argument from evidence. It is an argument from a model, and the model is being revised. Thomas Callaway, in his most recent writing on the subject, has drawn a distinction that he considers important between the question of what the evidence in the Callaway Chamber shows and the question of what it proves. He is clear that the evidence does not prove ancient Near Eastern contact with Western Australia in the sense that the word proof requires. The photographic evidence of the wall markings is suggestive but not definitive. The documentary evidence of suppression proves suppression but does not in itself prove that the suppressed material is what the Callaway family believes it to be. The oral tradition is profoundly significant as evidence of Aboriginal knowledge and continuity, but its specific historical claims about contact require corroboration from material evidence to be established in the way that academic history requires. What the evidence does show, he argues, is that proper investigation is warranted and has been prevented. That is the core case. Not that the answer is already known, but that the question has been prevented from being properly asked. This is, in its way, a more serious indictment than the specific historical claim would be, because it is not about a historical event that happened long ago and whose implications are primarily academic. It is about something that is happening now and that has been happening continuously for 100 years. The prevention of proper investigation is an ongoing act. The classification of the government files is maintained now, today, by decisions being made by people who are alive and accountable in ways that ancient maritime navigators are not. The question of why those files are still classified is the most immediately practical question in the whole account, and it is the one that has received the least satisfactory answer. The standard justification that the files are classified under heritage and security legislation is not an explanation. It is a description of the mechanism of classification. The question of why materials gathered in a geological survey in 1923 meet the threshold for continued classification under security legislation in the 21st century has not been answered by anyone in a position to answer it. The responses to formal questions on this point have been uniformly that the classification has been reviewed and maintained, which is information about what has happened and not about why. There is a class of answer to this question that is not publicly documented, but that is available in pieces to anyone willing to spend time with the people who have worked on this case and others like it. The answer that emerges from those conversations is not primarily about national security in any military sense. It is about a more diffuse kind of institutional risk, the risk of opening a question that, once opened, would be very difficult to close again in a way that left the current frameworks intact. If the chamber walls carry a genuine ancient script, and if that script is properly studied and its contents become known, the questions that would follow are not amenable to administrative management in the way that a classified geological survey is amenable to administrative management. They are questions about how old human activity in Australia is, about what the pre-colonial period contained, about the legal foundations of land title in a country that built its legal framework on a particular and now challenged understanding of that period. They are questions that connect to ongoing legal and political disputes about native title, about Aboriginal heritage protection, about the rights of communities to their cultural heritage. None of this is a reason to suppress the evidence. It is, in fact, a reason to bring it into the open because the questions will not go away simply because the evidence that raises them is kept classified. They are already being asked, they are being answered partially and unsatisfactorily in courts and legislatures and community meetings and academic papers and now in accounts like this one. The evidence that Edmund Callaway found in his paddock in 1923 and preserved in an envelope in his desk drawer is still out there. Some of it is in the State Archive. Some of it is in Thomas Callaway's possession. Some of it is in the Noongar community's ceremonial knowledge. Some of it is in a government file that no one outside the relevant agency has read since 1947 or possibly longer. And some of it, the most important part, is still in the deeper chambers that have not been opened. The land is patient, the stone is patient. The people who have been keeping faith with the agreement to remember are patient, as people must be when they are keeping faith across centuries. But patience is not the same as passivity. The story has been told, the evidence has been lodged, the questions have been asked and documented and asked again. The pattern of suppression has been mapped carefully enough that it cannot simply be denied. What happens next is not determined. It is a question about what kind of country Australia wants to be, about what kind of history it is willing to know about itself, about whose knowledge counts as evidence and whose memory counts as testimony. Edmund Callaway asked what they were afraid people would find out. It is a good question. It deserves an answer. The chamber is still there, fitted stone against fitted stone. the words on the walls waiting to be read, the deeper passages holding whatever was left there to be found. The waiting has already been very long. It cannot last forever. And somewhere in the red country east of Perth, where the salmon gum trees stand in the same ground they have always stood in, and the silence has that particular waiting quality that people who know the land have always described, the earth keeps its own time. Not the time of governments or academic journals or freedom of information requests. The time of stone and water and the slow, patient movement of the world beneath the surface. The farmers who work that country now mostly do not know what is beneath their feet. Most of them would not expect to find anything there that required serious attention. The landscape is too vast, too old, too apparently empty of the kind of history that gets preserved in textbooks and museums and the official record. But the landscape is not empty. It has never been empty. It has been full for longer than any of the people who now live above it have been here, of a history that does not fit neatly into the categories that make administration easier. A history of extraordinary endurance and complexity and connection. A history that certain institutions have found it convenient to classify and file away and not discuss in polite company. That history exists whether it is acknowledged or not. It is in the stone, it is in the stories. It is in the photographs in the archive. It is in the memory of a community that made an agreement to remember and has kept it. And it is now in this account, in the telling of it, in the fact that you have heard it and that it has become, in whatever small way, part of what you know about the world. Edmund Callaway could not have imagined, standing in his paddock in 1923, that the photographs he took that day with his wife's box camera would still be in existence 100 years later, or that the story of what he found would eventually be told in this way, reaching people he could never have imagined in places he could never have visited. But he kept the photographs. He wrote down his questions. He gave them to someone who would know what to do with them, as he hoped, and she did in her own time, and the person she gave them to has been working on the knowing for more than 50 years. The house of the old ones is still there, and the old ones, whoever they were, built it to last. That is the end of what is known. The rest is what is still waiting to be found out, which may, in the end, be exactly where it needs to be, in the waiting, in the patient, generational, stubbornly human refusal to let the question be buried along with the evidence. Because some questions are too important to be sealed away in a government file and left there. Some questions push up through the earth when the rain is heavy enough, and when they do, the right thing to do is exactly what Edmund Callaway did. Go and look, trust what you see, keep the photographs, and find someone who will know what to do with them. The red earth of the wheat belt holds its secrets in the way that all old things hold their secrets. Not by guarding them actively, but simply by enduring, by outlasting the urgency of concealment, by being there, still impatient, when the governments that classified the files have been replaced by other governments, and the administrators who marked the memoranda for restricted status are long since gone, and the pastoral leases have changed hands again and again, and the world has become a different place in almost every respect, except the most important one. The stone is still there, the markings are still on the walls, the knowledge is still held in the living memory of people who agreed to remember. And the question is still there, underlined twice at the bottom of a farmer's handwritten list. What are they afraid people will find out? We are still finding out. Sleep well. There is something worth considering carefully about the way this story has been told across the decades and about the gaps in the telling, because the gaps are not accidental. They are the shape of everything that was removed. When Edmund Callaway wrote his initial letters in 1923, he was operating in good faith within a system that he assumed was designed to serve the public interest. He found something, he reported it. He expected someone with more knowledge than himself to come and investigate properly and to share the results of that investigation with him because he was the one who had found it, and because sharing results seemed to him like the obvious and decent thing to do. This expectation was not naive. It was a reasonable assumption about how public institutions are supposed to work. What he encountered instead was the gap between how institutions are supposed to work and how they actually work when the results of proper investigation would be inconvenient for the interests those institutions serve. This gap is not unique to Australia in 1923. It is not unique to archaeology or to questions of historical evidence. It is a feature of institutional life that has been documented in every field and every era where powerful interests have had reason to prefer certain outcomes and the means to influence which outcomes get produced. The documentation of this gap in the specific case of the Callaway Chamber is itself a significant historical achievement. It took 70 years, several generations of a single family's sustained effort, the work of multiple researchers, the preservation of oral tradition by a community that had every reason to give up and did not, and a series of archival finds that could easily have not occurred. The fact that we know what we know is itself unlikely. The fact that we do not know more is not. Consider what was lost in the decades when the story sat in a drawer. Between 1923 and the early 1960s, when Ruth Callaway began her first serious attempts to understand what her father had found, there were people who knew things that are now inaccessible. The government men who came in August 1923 are long dead, and whatever they knew or believed about what they had assessed is buried with them, unless it was committed to writing in the classified files, which may or may not exist in legible form. The expert, whoever it was, who examined the 1923 photographs and produced the assessment that was summarized in the 1929 document that Thomas found in the Freedom of Information material. That person is also long dead, and the full text of their assessment is in the restricted file, unread by anyone outside the relevant agency for nearly a century. The Noongar elders, who held the most detailed knowledge of the site's history at the time of the original discovery, were not consulted at all, as far as the documented record shows. Their knowledge was not sought. In the colonial administrative framework of 1923, it would not have occurred to the relevant authorities to seek it. This represents a loss that cannot be fully quantified, because we do not know what those elders knew or how detailed their account of the site's history was, and because the chain of transmission from that generation to Wolga's generation and beyond will inevitably have involved losses and compressions that are inseparable from the transmission of any knowledge over time. What survived is what was determined enough to survive. And that itself tells us something. The story of the chamber is also, and perhaps primarily, a story about what it means to know something that the world is not prepared to acknowledge. This is an experience that is not confined to archaeology or to questions about ancient history. It is an experience that many people have had in many contexts across all of history. The experience of holding evidence that contradicts a consensus that benefits powerful interests. and of discovering that the consensus will not simply yield to the evidence, and of deciding what to do about that. Edmund Callaway decided to keep the photographs and the question. Ruth Callaway decided to keep asking. Thomas Callaway decided to build a case careful enough to be taken seriously. Raymond Walgar decided that the knowledge his community had maintained across all the centuries since the House of the Old Ones was built was worth sharing with someone who could carry it into the modern evidentiary framework, even knowing that the framework was imperfect and the reception uncertain. These were not easy decisions. They all carried costs. Callaway spent years in a state of unresolved uncertainty about something he had seen with his own eyes. Ruth spent most of her adult life thinking about a question she could not answer. Thomas gave his professional life to work that was never fully accepted by the institutions that might have been expected to support it. Walgar made the judgment that the time had come to trust someone from outside his community with knowledge that his community had protected for generations, a judgment that is never made lightly and that carries its own risks. None of them did this because they expected vindication in their own lifetime. They did it because they believed that the truth of what was under the ground east of Perth mattered more than the comfort of not knowing, and that the effort to bring it properly to light was worth making even if the results would not be fully visible until long after they were gone. This is the longest running thread of the story, not the question of what the chamber contains, but the question of what it requires of people to keep the question alive in the face of institutional indifference and active suppression. And the answer in this case is a great deal, more than could reasonably have been asked of any one person, more probably than was fair to ask of any family. But it was asked by the evidence and by the circumstance, and it was answered again and again by people who did not have to answer it, who could have put the photographs in the drawer and left them there, who could have decided that the gap between what they knew and what the official record said was simply too large to bridge, and who decided instead to keep building. The chamber has been sealed for 100 years. The evidence for its existence and significance has been preserved for 100 years by people who were given no institutional support and every institutional obstacle. The knowledge of it has been held in the living tradition of a community for a period that makes 100 years look brief. Whatever is in the deeper passages, whatever the marks on the walls say in the full grammar of the script they were written in, whatever the visitors from the sea left there to be found at a later time, all of that is still waiting. The waiting is not passive. It has never been passive. It has been actively maintained against the weight of 100 years of official dismissal by the people who understood that some things cannot be allowed to be lost, no matter what the cost of keeping them is. That is a kind of courage that deserves to be named as such. Edmund Callaway had it. Ruth Callaway had it. Thomas Callaway has had it for more than half a century. Raymond Walgar and the community he carried the knowledge for have had it for longer than any of us can properly imagine. The story is not over. It will not be over until the chamber is properly investigated, the files are released, and the full truth of what was found in 1923 and suppressed for a century is finally and completely known. But the story, in all the form it can take before that happens, is told. It is in the archive. It is in the record. It is out there now, in the way that stories get out there when they are told carefully and with sufficient evidence to make dismissal difficult. Edmund Callaway kept the photographs because he trusted what his own eyes had seen. That trust was not misplaced. It has been vindicated imperfectly and incompletely, and not yet finally, by everything that followed from it. Trust what you see. Keep the evidence. Find someone who will know what to do with it. The rest eventually takes care of itself. Now let us go further back, before 1923. Before the colonial administration, before the pastoral leases and the geological surveys, and the government cars driving away down dirt tracks. Let us go back to the oldest layer of the story, the one that is not in any archive, that has never been classified by any government, that has been preserved not in paper or in stone, but in the living minds of people who understood that some knowledge is too important to be trusted only to material things. The Noongar people of southwestern Australia have been in their country for at least 45,000 years. This is not a contested figure. It is the conservative estimate based on archaeological and genetic evidence, and the actual period of continuous occupation may be considerably longer. 45,000 years is a duration that is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. For context, the entire period of human history that most people learn about in school, from the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt to the present, spans approximately 5,000 years. The Noongar connection to their country is 9 times longer than the entirety of recorded history. During this time, the Noongar people developed a body of knowledge about their country, its geology and ecology, its seasons and cycles, its history and significance. That is itself an extraordinary intellectual achievement. Knowledge systems built over 45,000 years of careful observation and systematic transmission are not primitive or simple. They are, in their own terms, more sophisticated than the knowledge systems of civilizations that have existed for a fraction of that time, because they have been tested against reality for longer and refined through a more extensive process of verification by experience. The knowledge that Raymond Wolgar carried about the House of the Old Ones was part of this larger body of knowledge. It was not a separate thing, a curiosity about a foreign structure with no connection to the rest of Noongar life and understanding. It was woven into the fabric of a coherent account of the country and its history, an account in which the arrival of the visitors from the sea was a significant event but not an incomprehensible one, because the Noongar understanding of the world was large enough to accommodate visitors from far away. This is worth emphasizing because there is a version of the ancient contact question that is sometimes told in a way that implies that pre-colonial cultures like the Noongar people would have been overwhelmed or radically transformed by contact with a more technologically advanced civilization, and that the oral tradition is therefore evidence of something that happened to the Noongar people rather than something the Noongar people participated in. This framing is not supported by what the oral tradition actually says, or by what anthropological understanding of such traditions generally suggests. The Noongar oral account, as Wolgar described it to Thomas, does not depict the visitors from the sea as superior beings who arrived and changed everything. It depicts them as people who came from far away, who built something, who interacted with the people who were already there, and who then left. The structure they built was not appropriated by the Noongar community as something of the visitors and foreign to themselves. It was incorporated into the Noongar understanding of the country as something that was now part of the country's history, cared for and witnessed by the people who were there when it happened and who had agreed to remember. This is, in fact, a very sophisticated cultural response to contact with outsiders. It acknowledges the reality of the encounter without subordinating the existing culture's framework to the new arrivals. It preserves both the specific memory of the event and the broader continuity of the culture's relationship with its country. And it does this across a span of time that makes the task of preservation itself one of the most remarkable achievements in the entire account. Think about what it means to maintain a specific piece of knowledge for long enough that it can be recovered by researchers in the 21st century and corroborated by physical evidence found in the ground. The preservation of the Noongar oral tradition about the house of the old ones is not simply a matter of memory. It is a matter of social organization, of ceremonial structure, of the careful management of who holds which knowledge and how it is transmitted to the next generation. It is a collective achievement of extraordinary sophistication, spanning hundreds or thousands of generations. This is what was dismissed when the government men came in 1923 and assessed the site and filled it and marked the file restricted. Not just the physical evidence in the chamber, the entire edifice of knowledge that the Noongar community had maintained about that site for a period of time that dwarfed anything the Commonwealth of Australia had existed for, was dismissed as irrelevant to the determination of whether the site was of significant interest. The irony of that determination is almost too large to fit in a single thought. A site whose significance was attested to by the oldest continuous oral tradition of which we have evidence, a tradition maintained by people who had been in the relevant country for 45,000 years, was determined to be of no significant interest by an administrative process conducted over a single afternoon by people who had arrived in the country 150 years before. The arrogance of that determination is breathtaking, and it was not accidental. It was not the product of oversight or ignorance in any simple sense. It was the product of a systematic framework that was designed to produce exactly that result. Because the alternative, acknowledging that the site was significant, acknowledging that the Noongar people's knowledge of it was reliable testimony, acknowledging that the evidence of ancient contact raised questions that the colonial legal framework could not easily accommodate. Those alternatives were too costly to entertain. They remain costly. That is why the files are still classified in the 21st century. The cost has not gone down. The questions that the evidence raises have not become less disruptive to the frameworks that continue to govern land ownership and heritage management in Australia. In some respects, they have become more disruptive, because the legal and political landscape has shifted enough that questions that could be administratively managed in 1923 now have the potential to generate legal consequences that they did not then. This is not a comfortable situation for anyone who has an institutional interest in the status quo. And the status quo has many institutional defenders, not all of them acting from bad faith or deliberate malice, but many of them acting from the entirely human tendency to protect the frameworks that have organized their understanding of the world against the evidence that would require those frameworks to change. The evidence will require them to change. It already has, in partial and imperfect ways that are visible in the legal recognitions of native title, in the growing academic acknowledgement of the complexity of pre-colonial Australian history, in the changing public understanding of what Aboriginal cultures had achieved over the 45,000 years before Europeans arrived. The direction of travel is clear, even if the speed is frustratingly slow and the resistance frustratingly persistent. The chamber will be properly investigated. The files will be released, whether by government decision or by time's eventual erosion of the classification's basis. The wall markings will be studied by people with the knowledge and equipment to read them. The deeper chambers will be entered, and whatever is there will be examined. This is not a prediction based on optimism. It is a prediction based on the pattern of how these things go, which is that evidence preserved with sufficient care and determination eventually forces its way into the public record, regardless of the institutional obstacles in its path. The only questions are when and how much will have been lost in the waiting. The salmon gum trees east of Perth do not answer questions about timing. They simply stand in the ground they have always stood in, and they grow according to their own understanding of time, which has no reference points that human administrative calendars would recognize. They were there before the colonial surveys. They will be there after the current pastoral lease expires, and whatever comes next begins. They are not waiting. They are simply present in the way that living things that have no concept of urgency are present, completely and without reservation, in the moment they inhabit. Perhaps that is the right relationship to have with the unanswered question. Not waiting for it to be resolved, but being present with it. Holding it the way the Noongar people have held their knowledge of the house of the old ones. Not as a burden or an obligation or a source of urgency, but as part of what they know about their country, part of the fabric of their understanding of the world they live in. The question is not separate from the life that is lived around it. It is part of it. The people who have carried it have lived full lives around it. Edmund Callaway farming his wheat and raising his children and keeping the photographs in his drawer. Ruth teaching her classes in Meriden and thinking about the question in the evenings. Thomas building his academic career and his network of researchers while the central question remained in the background of all of it. Raymond Wolgar fulfilling his responsibilities as keeper of his community's knowledge, while also reaching out across the divide to share what could be shared at the moment when sharing seemed right. All of them carried the question, and all of them lived their lives. The question was part of the life, not separate from it, not a burden that displaced everything else, but a thread woven through everything else that gave it, perhaps, a particular kind of texture. A sense of being connected to something larger and older than any individual life. A sense of being part of a story whose ending was not yet written and whose importance was not yet fully understood. That is what it means to carry the kind of knowledge that institutions do not want you to have. It does not make life smaller. It makes it larger in the specific way that knowledge of unresolved important things makes everything larger, by placing the daily details of ordinary life in a context that is wider than any single person's experience. The context here is very wide indeed. It goes back to the moment, whenever that moment was, when people who had come a very long way decided to stop in a particular place in the interior of Western Australia and build something to last. They chose their stone well, they fitted it with care, they marked their walls, they were there long enough to be remembered, and then they left. Why they left is another question that has not been answered and perhaps cannot be. The oral tradition speaks of departure, but not of reasons. The silence on this point may be itself significant, a gap in the transmission of knowledge that reflects either a genuine forgetting or a deliberate withholding of something too sensitive to pass on in the ordinary way. Or it may simply be that the reasons were not known to the people who were there to witness the departure, that the visitors left without explanation or without an explanation that could be conveyed across the language barrier that must have existed between them and the people they were leaving behind. What they left behind, apart from the structure itself, is also not fully known. The deeper chambers have not been opened, at least not by anyone whose account of what they found is part of the accessible record. The full text of the wall markings has not been read. The artifacts, if there are artifacts, have not been catalogued. What the Noongar oral tradition says about what was left in the deeper chambers is held in ceremonial knowledge that was not shared with Thomas in its full detail. The full picture is still incomplete. The edges of it are visible. The shape of it can be estimated, but the interior is still sealed, both literally and in the sense that the knowledge to fully interpret what the physical evidence would show is not yet available to anyone working outside the restricted government files and outside the ceremonial knowledge of the Noongar community. What is available is what has been documented: the photographs, the archive records, the oral tradition account that Walgar chose to share, the pattern of suppression, the accumulated evidence of 100 years of careful preservation against institutional resistance. That is enough to know that the question is real, enough to know that the evidence has been preserved, enough to know that the investigation, when it is finally conducted properly, will have a foundation to work from, and it is enough for now to tell the story, which is what has been done here. The stone chamber east of Perth exists. It was found by a farmer in 1923 and sealed by a government that did not want it known. It has been kept in living memory by a community that has been there for 45,000 years and that made an agreement to remember. It has been documented by 3 generations of a family that refused to be told it did not matter. The evidence for its existence is preserved in multiple archives and is available to any researcher who asks for it. The deeper truth of what it contains is still waiting, but it is waiting in a way that has a shape now and a history and a record. That is more than it had in 1923 when Edmund Callaway walked in from Zappatic and sat down at the kitchen table and told his wife that he had found something he did not understand. He understood more than he knew, in the way that people who trust their own eyes and keep their evidence and write down their questions always understand more than they know. The understanding accumulates. It passes from hand to hand across generations. It grows. The answer is not yet fully known, but the question is still there, and the evidence is still there, and the people who care about it are still there. That is enough to keep going. Sleep well. The earth keeps its time. The stone holds its silence. And somewhere in the wheat belt country east of Perth, in the red ground beneath the salmon gum trees, the house of the old ones waits, as it has always waited, for the moment when the world is finally ready to hear what it has to say. There is one more thread in this story that has not yet been pulled fully into the light, and it concerns the question of what similar cases in other parts of the world might tell us about the pattern we have been tracing in Western Australia. Because the Callaway Chamber is not, as I noted earlier, an isolated anomaly. It is one point in a larger constellation, and the constellation becomes more coherent when you step back far enough to see its full shape. In the 1870s, a surveyor working in coastal Queensland reported finding on a rock face inland from the coast a series of markings that he described in his field notes as resembling writing of a kind he could not identify. He sketched them as carefully as he could and noted the location. His field notes were submitted to the Colonial Survey Office and were archived in the ordinary way. When a researcher attempted to locate them in the 1980s, the field notes for that particular surveyor's work in that particular year were missing from the archive, not misfiled, not damaged, simply absent in a way that suggested they had been removed rather than lost. In the 1920s, a prospector working in the Northern Territory found, in a dry creek bed, a series of stone objects that did not match any known Aboriginal tool type and that bore markings similar to those described by visitors to the Callaway Chamber. He brought several of them to Darwin and showed them to a government geologist. The geologist was interested enough to write a formal report, which was submitted to the relevant Commonwealth authority. The prospector never received a response. Several years later, when he inquired about his objects, he was told that they had been assessed and found to be of geological rather than archaeological origin, and that they had been disposed of as part of a routine clearance of non-significant material. In South Australia in the 1930s, a farmer found during ploughing a section of worked stone that he recognized as unusual and reported to the local police, who forwarded his description to the relevant department. A government representative came, examined the site, and told the farmer that what he had found was a natural geological formation. The farmer, who had been ploughing stone-free ground for 20 years and knew the difference between a natural geological formation and worked stone, did not accept this explanation, but also did not pursue it further, because he had other things to worry about in the middle of the Depression, and because the government representative had been emphatic and not particularly friendly in his manner. These are small cases, individually. None of them has the documentation that the Callaway Chamber case has accumulated. None of them has the combination of physical evidence, archival corroboration, and oral tradition testimony that makes the Callaway case as strong as it is. But together, and alongside dozens of similar cases in Hendricks' file, they describe a pattern of response that is itself significant, because patterns of institutional response reflect institutional priorities, and the consistent priority across different states and different decades and different types of discovery of assessing and closing and classifying sites of possible archaeological anomaly without proper expert investigation suggests something that is more than coincidence. It suggests policy, not necessarily written policy, not necessarily a formal directive that says, when you find evidence of possible pre-colonial contact or construction, assess it quickly, classify it, and ensure it does not enter the public record. It may be more diffuse than that. An institutional culture in which certain kinds of findings are understood to be sensitive in a particular way, in which the people responsible for managing them understand without being explicitly told that these findings are not to be publicized, in which the mechanisms of classification and restricted access are used not because someone has calculated that national security requires it, but because the alternative, leaving these findings in the public domain, where they might generate attention and questions and pressure for further investigation, is understood to be more trouble than it is worth. This is how institutional suppression works in practice most of the time, not through grand conspiracy, through the accumulation of individual decisions made by individual people responding to their understanding of what their institution wants, producing an outcome that no single person planned, but that serves certain interests very effectively nonetheless. The interests it serves in this case are the interests of a particular narrative. The narrative that Australia's pre-colonial history was relatively simple, that the evidence for complex pre-colonial activity is limited, that questions about ancient contact are fringe concerns not deserving of serious institutional attention. This narrative is convenient for a number of overlapping institutional interests, as has been discussed. What is perhaps less often stated plainly is that it is also simply wrong in the specific sense that the evidence for its wrongness has been consistently available and has been consistently managed away from the public record. The evidence has survived anyway. That is the point. The evidence has survived because the people who held it refused to let it disappear. And the evidence is strong enough now that the narrative cannot simply reassert itself without encountering the documented history of its own construction and the documented reality of what it has been constructed to conceal. Edmund Callaway is 100 years gone. The photographs he took are in the State Archive. The government file that classified what he found is still restricted. The chamber is still sealed. The markings on the walls are still unread by any expert with the knowledge to read them who has been permitted to examine them. The deeper chambers are still unopened, and the question is still there, underlined twice at the bottom of a handwritten list that is also in the archive. What are they afraid people will find out? We have been answering that question slowly and imperfectly and with enormous effort for 100 years. The answer is not yet complete, but it is larger and more solid and more clearly supported by evidence than it has ever been. The stone is patient. The knowledge is alive. The record is preserved. The rest is still coming. There are researchers now younger than Thomas who have grown up in a world where the questions raised by the Callaway Chamber are less automatically dismissed than they were when he began his work. They are working with technologies that were not available to any of the previous investigators. Ground-penetrating radar that can map underground structures without disturbing them. DNA analysis tools that can extract genetic information from ancient organic material. Digital image enhancement that can make details visible in photographs that were invisible to the naked eye. Computational linguistics tools that can compare script forms across thousands of documented writing systems in seconds rather than years. Some of these researchers have applied available technology to the Callaway photographs already, working from the archive copies rather than from the originals, which would require government access to examine directly. The results of this analysis have not been formally published because the researchers involved are cautious about the same concerns that have shaped the Callaway family's approach to publication across the decades. The concern that premature publication will invite dismissal rather than engagement, the concern that publication in the wrong venue or the wrong format will associate the evidence with the fringe discourse that has made legitimate investigation harder. But the analysis has been done, and the people who have done it are not dismissive of the evidence. They are in fact more confident than Ashford was in the 1970s because they have more tools and more comparative material, that what is depicted in the photographs is a genuine script rather than decorative or natural marking, and that the script forms are consistent with a family of early alphabets whose distribution in the ancient world is itself an active area of scholarly research. The specifics of what they have found are not something that can be fully laid out here without risking exactly the premature association that the researchers are trying to avoid. What can be said is that the photographic evidence subjected to modern analysis continues to support the conclusion that it depicts a genuine writing system of possible ancient Near Eastern origin, and that this conclusion has not been undermined by any analysis that has been conducted. The ground-penetrating radar results, obtained in a survey conducted informally and with difficulty in the vicinity of the site, are less conclusive, partly because the survey was necessarily incomplete given the access limitations, and partly because the ground in the relevant area has been disturbed by both the original collapse and the subsequent filling, making interpretation of the subsurface data complex. But the survey did not fail to find evidence of subsurface structure in the area of interest. It found evidence that is consistent with the existence of chambers and passages beneath the surface, though not definitive enough to establish their extent or character without further investigation. These results have been shared with Thomas and with the Noongar community representatives who are part of the ongoing heritage consultation. They have been lodged in summary form with the State Archive to become part of the accumulating record. They have not been submitted to the government as the basis for a new investigation request, because the researchers involved believe that the current political climate makes such a request unlikely to succeed, and that the time and effort would be better spent continuing to build the evidentiary case until it reaches a threshold that is harder to deny. What that threshold is precisely is not entirely clear. The researchers are working toward it rather than from it, but the direction is clear. More evidence, more rigorous analysis, more documentation, more public record. The strategy that has served the Callaway family across 3 generations, pursued now by a broader network of people with better tools and a clearer understanding of what they are up against. The question of whether this strategy will succeed in any meaningful time frame is genuinely uncertain. The government files may not be released in anyone's lifetime who is currently involved in the investigation. The site may remain under pastoral lease with access limited for decades to come. The political will to conduct a proper investigation of an inconvenient archaeological site does not appear to be building rapidly in the current climate. These are real constraints and they would be dishonest to minimize. But the evidence is accumulating, the public record is growing, the story is being told in more places, to more people, with more supporting documentation than at any point since 1923. The Noongar community's formal involvement in the heritage process, limited as its practical effect has been so far, represents a recognition that was not present at any earlier point in the story. The academic environment, imperfect as it remains in its treatment of oral tradition and of unconventional evidence, is more open than it was when Thomas published his first paper in 1993. Things change, slowly against resistance, with costs that should not have been necessary, but they change. The terra nullius doctrine fell. The stolen generations were officially acknowledged. The complexity of pre-colonial Australian history is entering the mainstream in ways that would have been unthinkable in 1923. The direction of travel is, in the long view, toward the truth being more fully known rather than less. The process is painful and uneven, and there are reversals and delays and moments when the resistance seems entirely impenetrable. But the direction is there. Edmund Callaway trusted what his own eyes had seen, and he was right to. Ruth Callaway trusted that the question mattered enough to keep asking, and she was right to. Thomas Callaway trusted that careful, methodical, honest work conducted in good faith within the frameworks of legitimate scholarship and with full respect for the Noongar community's role in the story, would eventually produce a record that could not simply be ignored, and he has been right to. The house of the old ones is still there. The knowledge of it is still alive. The record of everything that has been done to keep that knowledge alive and to build toward a proper investigation is part of the public record now, preserved in ways that make its future suppression much more difficult than its past suppression was. The rest is still waiting, but the waiting now has a different quality than it did when Edmund Callaway sat down at his kitchen table in August 1923 and tried to find the words to explain to his wife what he had found in his paddock. It has the quality of something that cannot be much longer delayed, of a question that has been asked too carefully and preserved too thoroughly and documented too completely to be answered only by silence much further into the future. The stone is patient. The knowledge is alive. The question is still there. And somewhere beneath the red earth of the wheat belt, in the fitted stone dark of the deeper chambers that have not yet been opened, the answer is waiting. It has been waiting for a very long time. It can wait a little longer, but not forever. Sleep well. Let us stay a little longer with the silence of the wheat belt, because there is something in that silence that the rest of the story has perhaps not given enough space to. It is easy when you are following a trail of documents and photographs and suppressed government files and legal maneuvers and academic papers rejected and resubmitted and rejected again, to lose track of the thing at the center of all of it. The physical reality, the stone itself. Stone of the kind that was used in the chamber, the flat-faced metamorphic granite that the wheat belt country sits on, is among the oldest rock exposed at the Earth's surface anywhere in the world. The Yilgarn Craton, as geologists call it, the ancient bedrock beneath that part of Western Australia, is in places more than 3 billion years old. 3 billion years. In that time frame, the appearance of human beings, any human beings, is so recent as to be almost undetectable. The appearance of people who built chambers and wrote on walls is so recent as to be genuinely invisible to the stone itself. The stone does not know it has been built into a structure. It does not know that markings were made on its surface. It does not know that governments came and filled the hole above it and classified the photographs and marked the files restricted. It is simply stone doing what stone does, which is endure. And in its endurance, it preserves what was done to it, the fitting, the marking, the weight and intention of whoever placed it where it sits, in a way that is immune to administrative decisions about what should and should not be part of the public record. Stone is the ultimate archive. It does not misfile things. It does not remove pages from registers. It does not cooperate with confidentiality agreements. It simply holds what was placed on it and in it and against it, without judgment or preference, until something more powerful than it comes along and changes its form. Water can do it. Time can do it. The slow movement of the earth can do it, as Edmund Callaway found to his benefit in 1923. As the wheat belt flood found to the benefit of everyone paying attention in 2007. But a government memorandum marked restricted cannot do it. A classification review that recommends maintaining confidentiality cannot do it. An administrative determination that a site is of no significant interest cannot do it. Those things affect the paper record and the institutional response, but they leave the stone entirely unmoved. The chamber is in the stone. The markings are in the stone. The deeper passages are in the stone, and the stone is in the red earth of the wheat belt, patient and permanent and entirely unimpressed by the century of human drama that has been conducted in its vicinity. There is something deeply reassuring about this. Whatever has been suppressed in paper and in institutional memory is not suppressed in the ground. The evidence is there, unchanged and unchangeable, waiting for the moment when the people who want to examine it properly are finally given or finally take the opportunity to do so. That opportunity will come. The stone will be there when it does. And then, finally, perhaps, the question that Edmund Callaway underlined twice at the bottom of his list will receive the answer it has been waiting for. Not because someone decided to reveal it, not because a government changed its mind about what should be classified, but because the stone was patient enough and the people who cared about the truth were stubborn enough. And the combination of those two things, patience and stubbornness, turned out to be more durable than the institutional preference for silence. That is the oldest kind of justice, slower than any legal system, older than any government, but reliable in the end, as reliable as stone. Sleep well, the earth is keeping time. One last thing deserves to be said about the nature of the evidence and about what it asks of those who encounter it. There is a particular discomfort that arises when you spend time with a case like this one. It is not the discomfort of encountering something that seems impossible. The evidence for the chamber's existence is strong enough that dismissing it on grounds of impossibility requires you to dismiss a great deal of very carefully preserved and documented material, and most reasonable people, when they look at that material honestly, find they cannot do this. The discomfort is more subtle than that. It is the discomfort of not knowing what to do with something you cannot deny, but also cannot yet fully know. Edmund Callaway had this experience. He found something he could not explain and could not dismiss, and he was given no help in explaining or understanding it, and he lived with that irresolution for the rest of his life. Ruth Callaway had it. Thomas Callaway has had it for 50 years. And anyone who encounters the evidence now and follows it with the seriousness it deserves will have it too. This discomfort is productive. It is the feeling of genuine inquiry, of being in genuine contact with a question that has not yet been answered, of caring enough about the truth to stay with the uncertainty rather than resolving it prematurely in one direction or another. It is less comfortable than either confident belief or confident dismissal, but it is more honest than either, and it is from that honest discomfort that real understanding eventually grows. The Callaway Chamber demands honest discomfort. It is not a story with a neat conclusion. It is not a mystery that has been solved, or a conspiracy that has been fully exposed, or a truth that has been completely known. It is a case that is still open, still active, still accumulating evidence, still pressing against the institutional resistance that has contained it for 100 years. The most honest response to it is to hold the evidence seriously, and the conclusions provisionally, and the question continuously, because that is where the story actually is right now. Not at a resolution, but in the middle of a long and difficult process of finding one. That process is not over. It will not be over for some time. But it is further along than it was 100 years ago, and it is further along than it would have been without the particular courage of the people who carried it through the decades when it would have been easier to let it go. They did not let it go. The stone is still there. The question is still there. Sleep well, and if by some chance you find yourself unable to sleep even now, even after all of this, even after the long journey from a muddy paddock in 1923 through a century of photographs and archive boxes and classified files and ceremonial knowledge and patient Noongar memory, then consider this. You are lying in the dark in whatever part of the world you're in, and beneath you the earth is doing what the earth does, holding everything that has ever been placed in it or built upon it or left in it by any person or creature or force that has ever existed, holding all of it without preference or judgment in the same patient way that the Yilgarn Kraken holds the fitted stone of the chamber, and the writing on its walls and the deeper passages and whatever is in them. 3 billion years of patience, 3 billion years of endurance, and somewhere in the middle of all that time, a moment that lasted perhaps a generation, when people came from the sea and built something and marked it and left, and a community of people who were already there agreed to remember. And the remembering has continued all the way to this moment, all the way to you hearing this in the dark. You are connected to it, not in a mystical sense, but in the plain human sense that you now know the story. And knowing it makes you part of its continuation, one more person in the chain of people who have encountered this evidence and found it too important to let pass without attention. Sleep well. The earth keeps time. The stone holds its silence, and the answer is coming. Slow as stone and patient as memory, on its own time, which is not our time, but which will arrive eventually, when the waiting has been long enough. Good night.